Perfect. Good evening and welcome to the first of what I hope is an ongoing conversation in our legal community regarding issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Christie Emrich and I am the Clark County Bar Association's current president. The CCBA is very happy tonight to join together with our other sponsors in bringing you this diversity forum. The Clark County Prosecuting Attorney's Office Action and Reform Committee, our local Washington Women Lawyers chapter, and our George and Donald Simpson Inns of Court. Together, we have formed this diversity forum, and we are hoping that you will have a great takeaway and an ongoing conversation here. The CCBA has created a new committee for 2021. It's called our Membership Committee. And I'm going to quote from the American Bar Association because, quite frankly, I think they said it a lot better than I'm going to. In an article called Diversity in the Legal Profession, the Next Steps, they said that bar associations are critical vehicles for advancing diversity and inclusivity because we help shape the norms of our profession. So at the CCBA, we're hoping that we can start engaging and shaping those norms in a more diverse and inclusive way here in Clark County. Under that guise and under the leadership of Erica Quadro, who is one of our newest trustees, we're going to be actively seeking attorneys who want to partner with us in this endeavor. And basically, there's going to be 3 ways you can be involved. First, membership. We really want to expand the membership of underrepresented populations, and we're hoping to do that through outreach. And we also want to retain diverse populations here in Clark County, and then we can do that through support and mentorship. So if you're interested in helping us create those kind of support systems here in Clark County, I would really ask that you contact either myself or Erica after tonight and get engaged with us as we work on that going forward. We're hoping what that membership committee will do is help transform even our Clark County Board operations. I would love to see a more diverse and inclusive trustee board. And we're hoping to actively and intentionally foster a leadership pipeline straight from those membership committees, from the mentorship and the support of those attorneys. And then finally, in public outreach, attorneys, it's up to us to promote access to justice in our community. And we can do that across practice areas. So whether you're a guardianship attorney, a criminal attorney, a family law attorney, or practice in the civil arenas, you're the one that knows the barriers your clients are facing in our current court system. And we need to hear what those are. And then we need to start brainstorming solutions to our local barriers. So that's going to be our goal. And moving forward, that you'll want a partnership with us in that endeavor. So without further ado, we're going to get started to this evening. I would like to announce our next speaker, the Honorable Judge Emily Sheldrick.
Thanks, Christy. So thanks everyone for being here. After the killing of George Floyd, the Prosecuting Attorney's Office decided to form the Action Reform Committee in order to address the issues of systemic racism and bias that exist in our criminal justice system. The PA's office website has a link with the mission statement that you can see there, as well as some information about the work of ARC. When I was with the PA's office, I participated in ARC and a subcommittee on community outreach. We were brainstorming ideas on how we could get the conversation started in community on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we came up with the idea for this forum. We're fortunate to have so much interest in today's forum with the sponsorships that Christy mentioned, and I want to especially thank the Washington Women Lawyers and the Bar Association for their generous financial contributions to make sure we can have this Zoom webinar. Before we start, I do want to thank everyone for being here today. Your participation means that you're interested in issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's a great start. But now some housekeeping. First, for the panelists, some Zoom etiquette to think about. Please remember to mute your microphone when you're not speaking. And for those of you who are listening, if you have questions, please put them in the chat function and identify the speaker or topic that you're interested in. At the end, we will have some time set aside so that we can answer those questions. And now for some ground rules as well. As you've witnessed over the last year, conversations about race and equity are at best difficult. So in order to have a productive conversation, we have to have humility and respect. So I encourage you to keep an open mind about the historical personal truths of inequality and appreciate that a minority sharing a personal experience about racism or bias does so without the protection of being Caucasian. So please do listen actively, speak from your own truths, and participate to the fullest that you can. And of course, be conscious of your nonverbal responses. And the goal here is not about agreeing, it's about having a deeper understanding of the issues. So those are just some basic ground rules. Thanks everyone again for being here. And I'm going to bring, I think, Jeff Ketty in to introduce our next speaker. But if I got that wrong, I'm sorry, Jeff.
That's all right. No, we're going to have our newly appointed Judge Camara Banfield present next.
Thank you. Not a judge yet, but I'm honored, and I'm here to introduce our Washington Supreme Court Chief Justice, Stephen Gonzalez. He is newly elected into that position, newly by the vote of his peers. This month, he became our Chief Justice in the Washington Supreme Court, and we are honored to have him here with us today. Prior to becoming a justice in our Supreme Court in 2012, he served 10 years as a King County Superior Court judge. You have the ability to go and just Google his name and see all the things that he's accomplished and all the things that he's done. He's had a very broad legal career, and one that we can all be very proud of. I want to talk to you about the Chief Justice that I know and why it's personal to me. My first interaction with our now Chief Justice, Stephen Gonzalez, was through the Washington Leadership Institute. The Washington Leadership Institute is a leadership development program created by the YWCA Board of Governors, and its mission is to recruit, train, and develop traditionally underrepresented attorneys for future leadership positions in our legal community. Chief Justice Gonzalez now sits on the board of the WLI. The time and dedication he gives to this program is his time. It's time he takes away from his own personal life. It is this dedication that brings him here to us today. This remarkable dedication is the reason for all of the awards, the accolades, and the accomplishments we all read about. When the door opens for him, he holds the door open for those of us behind him. He is personal to me. His work is personal to me. And tonight, as you join us in this conversation, I hope you make it personal to you. Chief Justice Gonzalez.
Thank you. By way of introduction, the court that I'm on now is very diverse, remarkable. In fact, we have 7 women, we have 3 women of color, 4 people of color, we have an immigrant, we have someone with a disability, we have 2 lesbian justices, we have 2 Latinos, we have 3 Jewish justices, I'm one of them. So the court is remarkable and different. And I first want to say that means that we're less efficient, because when you have different views, it can take longer sometimes. And that's a strength, that's a good thing, but it doesn't always mean we're going to be quick in our agreement, or that we're not going to disagree with each other. The letter that we issued on June 4th, 2020 was remarkable to me, because I didn't think in my lifetime I'd ever see a court willing to speak so directly about this issue. Since we have, We've gotten a variety of responses to it, most of them positive. In fact, a number of my judicial colleagues responded by saying it liberated them to talk directly about an issue that they had been reticent to address. And that is our own culpability in the state of affairs, in the way the justice system works. The tendency of the judicial branch, when faced with these issues, has been in the past sometimes to say, well, society is biased, and so we just get what we get. It's the bias that exists upstream and then continues downstream, but it's not us. Well, I'm glad that we're finally taking some responsibility for the role that we play and for the opinions that are still in the books that have used some, well, a kind way would be to say outdated language, but frankly, it's racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. And I think we have to own that those books are still published, that those opinions can still be cited as precedent, and some of them should be precedent for nothing except the mistakes that we've made in the past. Thank you.
All right, and Judge Sheldrick is now going to introduce our presentation about understanding race equity.
So we've asked Pamela and Elizabeth Fitzgerald. Pam is a practicing attorney here in Clark County for over 15 years. She's currently in-house counsel. And Elizabeth Fitzgerald is the executive director of the Volunteer Lawyers Program. And they're going to give a presentation, as you can see here, on understanding race and equity. This is to give us kind of a foundation for the conversation that we're going to have after they do their presentation. So with that, take it away.
Thank you, Judge. And thank you, Jeff, for directing the slides. Appreciate that. So to discuss race equity, and you can move on to the next slide, we first need to call out the inequity that exists in our community. Because systems of oppression are often invisible and sometimes intangible for those who profit from them, we'll be giving a few examples of how systemic racism has built a structure of inequity in our community. When we use the phrase systemic racism, we may use it interchangeably with structural racism or racialization. This term, as we use it, refers to the ways in which the joint operation of institutions produce racialized outcomes and perpetuate white supremacy. Systemic racism does not refer to racial slurs, nor good or bad intentions. It refers to a structure that is institutionalized, cultural, and internalized that leads to oppression by race. These systems historically used race to justify policies and practices that have enabled class delineations in society, whether in schools, neighborhoods, law enforcement, that oppress people of color. And it is our assertion that these systems, whether consciously or subconsciously constructed to oppress people of color, persist today in our community. Next slide, please. So before anything else, let's address that elephant in the room that we hear whispering, but Clark County is really white. How important is all this diversity work? Well, you're right. Clark County is disproportionately white, as is seen here, much more so than national percentages. What we're going to do is look at some of the contributing factors to this, including repeated exclusionary measures of Black community members. Next slide, please. Today, we'll be setting the stage for this larger conversation that will follow our presentation by specifically addressing key aspects of Clark County's continued systems of racial oppression. Beginning with a brief history on exclusion laws, we'll move into these 4 key areas in which people of color in our community experience dramatic inequity. We're going to talk about systemic racism, but it is important to note that direct and overt racism was present in our history and not that long ago. Over the summer, we presented a series of listening sessions on systemic racism, and the NAACP Vancouver brought to our attention this photo. It's powerful on its own, but I'd like to point out that first, this was a parade float, something that was brought out intentionally in broad daylight. Second, it was on Main Street. So anybody from the area of Vancouver knows Main Street. That's the core repository of our historic buildings and rich past. Pam mentioned to me, and you'll hear from Pam in a little bit, that throughout our community, but especially downtown Vancouver, there's a plethora of historical photos showing what life was like years ago. But we don't see these photos. Our history is filled with great stories and artifacts, but it's also entrenched in hate, violence, and racism. And it's important not to forget that this was a part of our not so long ago past. So despite an influx of Black neighbors to our community, especially during the wartime World War II, racial restrictive covenants were in full force in Clark County. These covenants were tied to a property's deed and included language barring the sale or even rental of that property to people of color. This right here is an example of a racial restrictive covenant in the neighborhood just west of the cemetery on the northwest corner of Mill Plain and Grand. You'll see that restriction number 2 states the property and or improvements thereon shall not be owned or occupied by anyone other than a member of the white race. The way in which these agreements were entered into actually put a legal prohibition on the owner of the property from selling or renting to the groups of people identified in the covenant. The covenant completely hampered certain individual freedoms of the signer and all future owners to choose to whom they sold their home. Because the owner could be sued and held financially liable, restrictive covenants were hardly ever contested. And this is a prime example of the power of the legal system to not only perpetuate segregation, but remove potential blame from city and county leaders by, in effect, segregating communities despite any zoning ordinances that may have been in place. And on top of this, we know significant social enforcement occurred to essentially bully realtors or homeowners into abiding by a racial restrictive covenant. This bullying would manifest in blacklisting the realtor from future transactions in the community or making it difficult for the buyer to obtain sewer, water, or other basic needs. And finally, what we see as perhaps the largest contributor to sustained long-term intergenerational wealth gap of Black and white families is the GI Bill. This is known formally as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. The GI Bill was specifically designed to be administered locally, thereby allowing local prejudices to determine to whom benefits were distributed. These benefits included anything from education and living expenses to low interest loans or low cost mortgages. All of those benefits empowered people to gain capital. Unfortunately, what we saw is that banks could and would choose not to lend to Black veterans. Realtors would intentionally avoid advertisement to Black veterans, and those racial covenants were prolific in deeds of sale. By 1984, the date when most GI Bill mortgages had matured, 7 out of 10 whites owned homes, but only 4 out of 10 Black folks owned homes. Today in Clark County, people of color live in poverty at 2 times the rate of white people. When someone is prevented from acquiring wealth, they cannot pass it to the next generation, and people of color become disproportionately destined to cycles of renting rather than wealth building. This slide right here is data that comes from my organization, Clark County Volunteer Lawyers, which operates a courthouse-based housing justice project. In that program, we assist tenants facing evictions, housing discrimination, or landlord-tenant disputes, and ultimately aim to prevent homelessness through that work. Our court, unfortunately, does not collect racial or demographic data on its eviction cases, but we do. Clark County does collect racial demographic data, though, and I've used that as a side-by-side comparison with the people we see facing evictions. What stands out most to me is the discrepancy in the 2.4% of the total population that is Black and the 12% of our eviction cases that are for Black tenants. We would expect them to see a similar metric for Hispanic clients, but other systems of oppression are likely contributing factors. I could easily talk about that for about 20 minutes on this specific disproportionality, but to remain succinct, I'll say fear of retaliation, deportation, and ICE involvement contribute heavily to underreporting of housing habitability concerns and to failure to appear at court hearings. So our local history is rife with repeated intentional exclusions of our Black community members. From across the board Black exclusion laws in the 1800s that specifically call for all Black residents to leave the territory, to wartime work that brought Black people back in only to force them out with racially restricted covenants, and barriers to the GI Bill, we've formed a wealth gap which results in a cycle of renting and in turn evictions of Black people. It's no surprise that despite only comprising 2.4% of our county's population, 13% of people living outside in Clark County identify as Black. There are a lot of comparisons of our community to that of Portland, but as a lifelong Vancouverite, it definitely bugs me too when people conflate our counties and our cities or make statistical generalizations that include us both. But I do think it's crucial to point out that with Portland having the reputation as being the whitest big city in the United States, we here in Clark County are actually whiter. And I'll turn it over to Pam.
Sorry, had to find my unmute button there. Thanks, Elizabeth, for setting the stage about our history within our community and the demographics. So as Elizabeth noted earlier, I'm going to talk about 4 different areas of our justice systems where people of color are impacted at disproportionate rates. We'll start off with looking at data from the YWCA Clark County. And what is up here on the slide is statistics regarding 35% of survivors of sexual assault identify as people of color. And we also have data from the Clark County Jail Reentry Team that 44% of reports of sexual assault are also from people of color. Now, I'd like to remind you that Elizabeth presented the 2019 demographic data earlier. And when you look at the collective percentage of Hispanic, Black, Native American, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders, that is only 14.7% of our population in Clark County. And so given that collectively, those major groups of people of color are at 14.7%, you can see that the data reveals that people of color are experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault at a much higher rate than their peers. Next slide, please. And then similarly, looking at another system within another justice system is our Clark County foster care system. Here you see data comparing the number of children of color involved in our foster care systems, and across the board you will see that they are brought into our system, foster care system, in higher numbers than white children. Next slide, please. And then again, continuing along patterns related to children, the Washington Attorney General last year issued a report that revealed that there was a repeated pattern of disparate treatment among children of color compared to their white classmates. Here you can see the statistics that show you many children of color are more likely to be expelled or suspended than their white peers. And these are children that are removed from school and deprived of the ability to continue their education. I will note that on a personal level, I can see how this happens within the Vancouver Public School District. I've had 2 kids within the system, and my experiences in having discussions regarding racial bullying, quite frankly, could use improvement. Our administrators and teachers are woefully unprepared to discuss conversations around race. And I think these statistics, based on my personal experience, are not surprising, given the lack of comfort that teachers and administrators have in addressing issues of race head on. Next slide, please. Here we can look at Clark County incarceration rates. These particular statistics are divided among our Black and white populations. And you'll see that from 1990 to 2017, again, we have disproportionate data between our Black incarcerated population and our white incarcerated population. Interestingly enough, as you look through the different years and see the spikes, you have to wonder and consider whether those are correlated to national or local criminal justice legislation. And note that over the years, the statistics of the white incarcerated population remains relatively unchanged and stable. Next slide, please. So one of the things I tried to do is find local data involving our justice involved populations. And to be honest, it's difficult. It is not readily available in many of our agencies or systems. Here, I was able to get a small snapshot of referrals for our Clark County drug court program. And again, for those of you that aren't familiar, drug court is a therapeutic program that produces thousands of cost savings to the community for each graduate of the program. And what you'll see on this graph here is that those who receive the benefit of referrals to this therapeutic program are primarily white referrals. So you've got, and just to highlight, sorry, Jeff, going back to that slide, we have 86% of referrals to the Clark County Therapeutic Court, where our population of whites in Clark County is 77%. So I think that this is just a small snapshot. And for those of you that are listening and are interested in keeping the conversation going about active commitments to equity, I'd encourage all of you to ask the question of our stakeholders: how are you going to move the needle forward if you do not have data? So please consider that. Thanks for this opportunity to set the stage about racial inequity and data within our county. I'll turn it over back to you, Jeff.
All right, thank you, Pam and Elizabeth. Great information about race equity within our county, issues with race equity within our county. So we are now going to move on to our onto our panel, and the purpose of tonight's panel is to talk about some of these issues in our local community, our statewide community. And we have 6 panelists who have agreed to join us, and Pam and Elizabeth also are here with us. I just want to remind you that after I ask some of these questions that we have pre-prepared, that we're open to having questions from the audience. So make sure that if you want to ask a question, that you put that question into the chat, state who you want to answer that question and what your question is. So I'm now going to introduce each of our panelists. Washington Supreme Court Chief Justice Stephen Gonzalez has already been introduced, but Justice Gonzalez, if you wanted to say anything about yourself quickly.
That's all right. I'll wait for the questions. Great to be here.
All right. Ana Sifuentes from the YWCA Clark County. Ana, if you can introduce yourself to the folks.
Hi, I'm the bilingual outreach advocate for the Safe Choice program here at the YWCA in Vancouver. And my main role is to work with the Latinx community here. And of course, we engage with social justice and all kinds of justice and outreach and exposures of services as well.
Thank you, Ana. Our next panelist is Christie Emrich, and Christie is the CCBA president. Christie, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi again, for everyone who doesn't know me, I'm a criminal defense attorney here in Clark County. I've been practicing for the last 15 years. Our firm holds the primary contracts for district court and a large contract in superior court, as well as a juvenile contract. So we are involved in a lot of areas in our local court system.
Thank you, Christie. Camara Banfield. Ms. Banfield, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
She may have been kicked off of Zoom.
Uh-oh.
Early.
Well, we'll come back to her then. Cindy Nosko. Oh, Cindy, we can't hear you.
I apologize, I forgot to unmute. My name is Cindy Nosko. I work with the Clark County District Court Interpreter Services. I provide interpreters for all of our limited English people and the deaf and the hard of hearing and the vulnerable in our Clark County courts. And that is all of our courts in Clark County, excluding Battleground Municipal. They have their own program for providing interpreter services to their court. I was hired in 1999, coming from the private sector, and I entered the world of the legal community, where I didn't know a thing about law, just knew that I had rights and that it was against the law to do certain things. I have been an administrator for the interpreter office for Clark County since 2008. And my main consumers, all my consumers stretch from all the work around the world, and they live here in our community in Clark County. They come from Russia, all the way west from Russia, to all the way east to the Asian Pacific Islands and China, and all those countries in between. And at this time right now, our top 5 languages in our community that we provide interpreter services for is our Spanish communities, our Russian people, our Micronesian, Asian Pacific Island people, our deaf and hard of hearing, and our Vietnamese community. So they are my main consumers, and I strive to help them and get them and provide court interpreters for their court hearings or their appointments. And I always will believe in fair treatment to our diverse community, to our people, to the human being who enter our house asking for assistance.
Thank you, Cindy. It's wonderful having you here. Ms. Cowger.
Cowger, I'm Graciela Gomez Cowger, and I'm the Chief Executive for Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt. We are a large general practice firm located in the 4 Western states. We have 8 offices, a little under 200 attorneys in total. Happy to be here. I no longer practice, actually. I'm mostly just manage attorneys. But delighted to be here, delighted to contribute with your questions, and hoping to learn as much as I hope to relate my own experiences.
Thank you, Ms. Cowger. And so the first question I was hoping you would be willing to answer. Our first question is describe any barriers you have encountered or observed regarding bias and racial equity within our legal community.
Thanks, Jeff, for the question. So here's the, as I was listening attentively to the presenters previously and to the framing of this panel, I was struck by, it's mostly packed into sort of the criminal justice system and sort of the systemic barriers to that. I have to admit to having little experience with the criminal justice system. as a lawyer or me personally, so yay me, haven't violated any laws, so I haven't been experiencing that. But I wanted to just express that to make sure that you understand. I don't actually know that world as well, and I don't want to speak out of turn in that sense. But I do have quite a bit of knowledge on the legal profession generally, and in terms of sort of the folks that are out there representing the community in various aspects, whether it be civil or criminal, there is a large gap in terms of the lack of diversity of the legal profession. Many of us have tried to diversify the legal profession and are attempting to do that, but it's coming at a glacial speed. And I think that has to do, that's true for a whole lot of reasons, one of which is, you know, the pipeline continues to be slow, although it is overused as a mechanism to signify the lack of diversity in the profession and the lack of of those of us that are in the legal profession, how we don't reflect the communities in which we serve. So I don't think it's all explained by the so-called pipeline, if you will, the folks that are coming in. I think those of us, it is incumbent upon those of us that hire lawyers to look harder and look at other places and be more specific about what we're doing. We've had at Schwabe, I'm proud to say that we've had great success recruiting attorneys of color, and we have some challenges retaining those attorneys of color. So I will tell you that even at our firm, such as Schwabe, where we have a long history and a long commitment to diversifying the profession, that we still come up short, I would say. So we are a firm of competing truths, if you will, in that sense. I think it's a difficult problem, but one we ought to lean into and really address as best we can. And I hope that at Schwabe we're doing that to some degree.
Thank you. Justice Gonzalez, same question. Describe any barriers you've encountered or observed with bias or regarding bias or race equity within our legal community.
First, I want to point something out, and I don't want to pick on my friend Graciela, but I want to point out something that might have been implicit in what she was saying. She said, you know, yay me, I haven't been involved in the criminal justice system. And I do want to celebrate that, but I also want to say that the idea that you're only involved in the criminal justice system if you break laws might not be true for everyone. I know that as a young man of color growing up in Southern California, I was stopped by law enforcement regularly. When I was a pedestrian, when I was on a bicycle, when I was driving. And I too wasn't committing laws, but had I been, I more likely would have been caught because of that disproportionate contact. I also know that Graciela understands that, and that's not what she meant to say, but I just want to clear the air on that point. I remember, I think it's 11 years ago now, when two then members of the Supreme Court for the state of Washington made statements about race that were deeply offensive to me, saying that the only reason that there are more Black people in prison is because they commit more crimes. That is simply wrong. And a clear example of that can show the truth to the lie is that drug use is largely the same across races. And dealing, in fact, is more prevalent among whites than it is people of color. Yet when you look at who is arrested, charged, convicted, and imprisoned for it, it's disproportionately people of color. So there are lots of myths about the criminality of people of color. And I think we need to be clear that we're not perpetuating those and we don't agree with that approach. So in answering it that way, I've talked a little bit about some barriers that I encountered coming up, including counselors and teachers who didn't expect much of me in school because of my heritage. It includes showing up when I became a prosecutor to court and being mistaken often for the defendant on a good day for the interpreter, but never for the prosecutor. People have an archetype in their mind about what certain roles look like, and I didn't seem to fit it. Those are some small examples. There have been other ones of overt racism and other times when I'm not sure what's going on, but I suspect that it is, which leads to a creeping paranoia about every slight. And you wonder, well, is this one race related too, or do they just not like me? Which I'll admit is a possibility. So there have been throughout every stage of my career barriers, but I believe that our job isn't to complain about the barriers, but to eliminate them and to keep the door open for the people who are coming behind us. And I know Graciela is doing that at her firm.
Thank you, Justice Gonzalez. Ms. Nosko, same question. Describe any barriers you've encountered or observed regarding racial bias and equity within our legal community.
There's two barriers I'd like to talk about. I'm going to go back into my little think box here. I had a Vietnamese interpreter that I worked closely with back in about 10 years ago. And I remember her telling me, Cindy, our interpreting is a thankless job. Our courts are surprised when we're at the bench and we begin to speak. Like, I didn't know we needed an interpreter. She explained that to me. So the barrier there was that maybe we didn't look at the person that was right before us and what their limitations were, whether in language, hearing, literacy, whatever the barrier is. So that's what made me think about the differences. The barriers we have is not understanding or recognizing differences. And being a public servant for half of my life, I have just enjoyed every bit of public service from retail to manufacturing and now in law, in the legal field, in the legal community. The other barrier I have is that I encountered in my years here with Clark County courts is the limited English person. The person that cannot communicate because they don't speak English or they cannot hear. They're confused. They don't know how to ask for help. That's the one thing I have noticed, that the people in our community in legal field with court cases, out of court appointments, every kind of appointment in our community, the people don't know how to ask for help until they're pressured. I think they're pressured. They go, do you need an interpreter? Do you need an interpreter? I mean, you know, how is it that you can say, you know, you don't know their name, but you hear their language. You didn't hear their name. You didn't hear an accent. You didn't hear you just didn't hear them. And that is one of the barriers of understanding and listening that we as a human being can do for the people in our community is just understand and listen to what another person is saying to you. And they will want your help.
Thank you, Cindy. Camara Banfield, I can still call you that for now. So,
Can you hear me?
I can. Describe any barriers you've encountered or observed regarding bias and race equity within our community.
Well, there have been many, but personally, as a prosecutor, my experiences having walked in that field is just having someone deny my experience, simply denying my experience and being unwilling to hear that experience and trust that experience and mocking what I'm saying is my experience. It is hard. It's incredible how resilient a person of color has to be to keep making it through the system as a participant, as a litigant. For me, I've told this story before, but and at our office, the Clark County Prosecutor's Office, we for felonies, we get up in the morning, we all sit at a giant table, and all the cases are dumped onto one table. And we go through those things. Every unit, every felony unit's represented there, and we're pulling our cases and we're reading our reports. And during that time, there's a sense of camaraderie, but also that, you know, the idea that you can ask someone a question about the report that you're reading, or tell someone a fact that's something that you're reading and get their feedback or give your feedback. And I found that early on, my experience was shut down. And one of the main cases I can tell you about, and I deal very strangely with these conversations compared to others, I use humor or I use bluntness, but I was reading through a report, and there was a report of somebody out in the East County, and all of us here in Clark County that are from here know what that means. And the person was drunk, ridiculously drunk, completely belligerent, and they walked through a property very far up onto a porch and banging on that door. And the police ended up coming out and getting that person. But what I had said, wow, had that person been Black, the cops would have been coming with, you know, a stretcher. It's not funny, but it's the truth. It's my reality. It's the things that I've learned and I've heard. And the way that I was shut down in that room full of old white men, honestly, it was incredible. And to try to continue to speak out in situations like that, that's the barrier. Not being allowed to share my experiences, those of my children, those of my uncles and my fathers. That's a barrier. Not being able to have that conversation. And how I've moved through that is to not let them stop me from speaking, to continue to have this conversation no matter what it means, to talk to the deputies that I supervised as the chief criminal, and let them know that you better look at who that is. This isn't blind to the person who's making that arrest. You better see what their experience is and why they've come into contact with law enforcement and why they're here in front of us today. And if that purpose is fair. And I continue to make myself have that conversation, no matter how uncomfortable it is for me, no matter how uncomfortable it is for those around me. And so that's it.
Thank you. Ana Sifuentes, same question. Describe any barriers you've encountered or observed with bias and race equity within our legal community.
Sure, you can hear me?
Yes.
I think that talking is something that most people in the legal community or the state and county programs is open to do. The difficult part is to have these programs and these people engage and committed to follow through and coming up with an action plan, a strategic plan, and engaging in creating tangible change. That's the difficult part for what I've experienced. And as a person of color, it's very difficult and very painful to have to go through these conversations over and over again with the experiences, the painful experiences of people of color have to continue to be exploited for the benefit of others so that others can be educated. As an advocate, I think that a good place to start a conversation on barriers and how to overcome it is to think about the difference between equity and equality and restorative justice and the responsibility that comes with it. For us, working with survivors from diverse backgrounds, and much of the barriers come to play when we're talking about a person's right and ability to access justice, as well as the policies that don't support or that do little to remove the fence that allow people to access their rights and protections. A large number of survivors reaching out to us need legal help. That's one of the things that 9 out of 10 people that walk through the door will ask for. And oftentimes that translates into domestic violence protection orders or family law related issues, as you know. So when starting these processes and the risk increases exponentially for survivors, the initial contact that a survivor has with a third party, whoever that third party might be, will set the tone for future interactions and will educate their decision making. So inappropriate responses to claims of violence, to dismissal of the person's experience, paternalistic behavior towards a person's life, not making information easily accessible and in a language that the average folk can understand is also a barrier. Defensive behaviors about, for when we bring up these experiences and we're talking about these issues, and invalidating those experiences, combined with the lack of ownership and accountability, are barriers that prevent us all from achieving and maintaining progress. Many of the survivors have difficulties with the protection order process, and most specifically with the service part. So taking the burden of survivors away from survivors and using alternative methods that are safer and more efficient, like giving that responsibility to law enforcement, or using alternative methods that will allow them to choose how they're going to serve, will go a long ways. So we have talked about and seeing many examples as advocates, me as an advocate, of abusers working around the system, hiding, denying their identities, and getting away with threatening and harming survivors. Most often we see these with survivors of color and immigrant survivors from immigrant communities. And unfortunately, this is allowed because of the stereotypes, the language barriers, the lack of education from the service provider or public service, whoever that might be. Blatant racism, covert racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, you name it, is out there. It happens still today. So all of those behaviors set us back and create huge barriers. So not talking about it and not bringing it out to light, as uncomfortable as it might be, that's nothing for us. Not taking into account the exponential levels of isolation and vulnerability that immigrant families and survivors experience under violent scenarios in their homes and violent environments, also within our society, in our streets. And not to mention the lack of true intentional bias awareness from those who hold position of power and who have the ability to change people's lives and to change people's lives and to truly make an impact for the better, are also barriers. And to also acknowledge the stereotypes that Brown and Black people are still being held to today. So there is a lot. I think that when I was thinking about this question, is that where do you grab it from? Where do you start? And I'm sure that most of us feel that way. But I think that not coming up with practical solutions and things that will truly make a difference and implement them and try them and follow them and see if they work. How do they work? How do they not work? Those things, not doing that is a huge barrier. And I think that at least for the most part, that's a lot of what we see, or what I see.
Thank you, Anna. And I do want to emphasize something. I think one of the things that's really hard for a lot of our panelists and people who are participating today is having to continually share personal experiences to educate our institutions and our community on these issues. And I really thank everybody who is here and is participating and is providing those personal experiences. But it is our responsibility, all of us who are on this panel, watching this panel today, it is our responsibility to educate ourselves and to get on board with change ourselves, and not to put it on all of these people who are presenting their personal experiences today. So I really appreciate that people are doing that, but it's on us to make these changes. So with that thought process, what actions, Anna, do you think we should be taking to influence our legal institutions we work with, so those institutions can adopt changes to combat systemic racism and implicit bias?
Jeff, can I suggest you take the questions down so we can see the panelists talking? I think we've read them.
Sure, I can see them, but maybe you can't. So I'll absolutely do that. Thank you.
So I think that we need to continue asking questions. Why isn't there more people of color sitting at the table and in positions of power? Why are the conversations that we're having today still relevant as they were 50 years ago? It takes acknowledging that the court and the legal system, the prison system, law enforcement, all of these systems were not created for people like us. They were created to oppress populations, and populations who have been purposely turning to minorities. And we're not talking about minority numbers, we're talking about minorities of taking away the power. Therefore, you have less presence and less ability to create change for the better of your community. As it has happened through history. So if these systems don't change at their very core and in their foundation, they will never be truly serving the purpose that they claim that they serve, nor will they be welcoming people who should be there to create true change, because there were people that were meant to oppress or to be oppressed by these systems. So I think that we need to really embrace restorative justice. We need to ask ourselves, who caused the harm? How have I, in my practices, professional or personal practices, reinforced the harm that has been done? How do they further that harm? And then how can I restore justice? How do I give people back their humanity? How do I accept responsibility, and what do I have to do to make true change, not just as in my position, but with the people that surround us? None of these can be done without mandating ongoing education about issues that relate to justice, race, privilege, gender, and how all of these overlap with the power that everyone holds in their role, from law enforcement to systems advocates, to judges, to clerks, to everybody. And we need to have accountability, right? There is nothing without having accountability and being able to sit down at the table and provide answers so that we can dissect these issues and dismantle them and unpack them and get rid of things that shouldn't be happening anymore. It is difficult, it is time consuming, it is probably very expensive, but what I will say is that we cannot afford to continue to lose lives. We cannot afford to continue to live in fear, and we cannot afford to continue to have our communities oppressed, and so this is absolutely necessary.
Christie, same question to you. What actions can each of us take to influence the legal institutions we work with so those institutions adopt changes to combat systemic racism and implicit bias?
I think I looked at that question twofold. First, I thought about myself. What am I doing in my own sphere, in my own office? What are my hiring practices? How does my office, how are we reflecting our community? How are we reflecting our clients? And that's a hard question to ask. I think we like to say, I look out and I'm like, oh, we're way more diverse in the prosecutor's office, so we're doing something good. But that's not the bar. And I have to take ownership of that, and I have to be deliberate in moving forward. A few years back, I looked around my office and I thought, oh my gosh, how is it suddenly we only have 3 female attorneys? We have 20 attorneys and I only have 3 women. How did that happen? And I had to get deliberate about where are we going with this? How do I bring these female attorneys back into my firm? And I think it has to be the same conversation with race going forward. We can't just hope that it's going to happen. And I have to be more deliberate in that. I think something that kind of brought that home to me, and not to call out Camara, who I will call Camara for a few more days, is the fact that we celebrate a woman of color being appointed to our bench for the first time. And that's wonderful. But the second thing I thought is, now we don't have a woman of color at the prosecutor's office. So I think that's something we have to take ownership of as a legal community. And it's something within my office I need to focus on as well. As I bring up new attorneys, that's what we do. We train and we bring in these great new passionate attorneys to criminal defense. And I want great new passionate attorneys that represent our community equally. So I think the second step in that is also then retaining. I look back on the history of my firm, and we've had people of color who have left because, quite frankly, they didn't feel welcome in practicing in Clark County. And one of my dear friends in particular, I think of, who just got tired of the fight. She just felt like she fought every time. And she fought, as a defense attorney, you fight for your clients and you're fighting the prosecutor and you're fighting against the court system. But she felt she was just fighting for herself every day. And that burden became too much to bear. And quite frankly, we shouldn't have asked her to bear it. So how do we going forward, prevent that from happening again? How do we retain those attorneys? How do we make them feel comfortable and welcome in this community? So those are the two things that come to mind for me in my personal sphere of influence.
Justice Gonzalez, same question. What actions can each of us take to influence the legal institutions we work with so those institutions adopt changes to combat systemic racism and implicit bias?
Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing the answers so far. And if there aren't women or people of color in your office, it isn't because there aren't qualified women or people of color. It's because qualified women and people of color don't want to work with you. There's something about the environment that makes them not want to be there or stay there once they get there. And I think that's part of owning it and flipping it around. Why don't they want to be here? Why don't we make them feel welcome? Is the other side of the same question. It takes a little bit of work and introspection. I've never had trouble recruiting diverse applicants, and then we pick the most qualified people, and it happens often to be a woman or a person of color. But if you create the welcome feeling in the pool in the first instance, I think you'll have better choices. So I know that in some way people apply to work with me because I have a reputation for addressing these issues head on, talking about it, working hard to make our chambers and after the court as a whole a welcome place to be. And I think talking about it is the way you do that, not pretending that it isn't an issue. Just address it head on.
Thank you. Ms. Cowger? Same question. What actions can each of us take to influence the legal institutions we work with so those institutions adopt changes to combat systemic racism and implicit bias?
I agree with everything. I agree with, for example, Justice Gonzalez. It says, you got to look at it from a bunch of different angles. One of them is how are you attracting and where are you looking for your talent? Try harder, frankly. We all need to try harder because the talent is out there. We just haven't we're not looking in the right places if we can't find it. So that's one, and I would agree with Justice Gonzalez on that point. The other side of that is, of course, as he points out, what are you doing to retain and what are you doing to make sure that the environment you have is a positive one, a welcoming one. And I would say also what I've done too is in the cities that we work in, Portland, in my firm, it's Portland, two major cities are Portland, Seattle. You need to make real specific efforts to reach out to those people of color that are coming into the community and saying, we're here. We may not be fully visible to you all the time, but we do exist. And there is some color in these various cities, and to make the point to invite people to today, meet virtually, tomorrow, hopefully go out and get a drink or get a meal and break bread. I've done that very successfully. I just keep a running list of, and I don't even know if they are of color. If they have a name that sounds kind of like color, if I see a picture, I'll invite them out and just meet them so that they feel that they know that there's a community that is accepting to folks. And I think we could do more of that in Clark County, even as I know that we're all quite busy and although we're more at home these days, so a virtual meeting is a little easier these days than it used to be. But I think, we need to put some effort into it and some intentionality into those actions so that folks do indeed feel comfortable. In terms of changing the structures that exist, not only is it having folks in positions of power, certainly that helps, but also, using techniques such as echoing. If you're in a meeting and you hear someone say something or challenge a structure or a method, echo what they're saying and elevate their voice and help them reach harder, even in places where it makes you uncomfortable. I think all of us can do some of that, you know, and again, it's infuriatingly slow. And I do think that the younger generation brings with it a large sense of impatience with those of us that have been living in these systems that haven't changed for a while and that changed so glacially. So I accept that as a challenge to do more and to be better and to try to do things faster. That means that all of us need to lean into uncomfortable conversations at times, including perhaps this panel.
Thank you. Cindy, Nosko.
Yes, some of the actions I've taken in my 21 years career here with Clark County in the legal field is that I include, I communicate to the body of the legal community to have them understand that we have a service in this county that provides to the limited English person, to the vulnerable, to the deaf, to the hard of hearing. We have services that are provided to the people and our neighbors, our community, and people that are in our court system. That's some of the actions I've been taking since I sat in this chair 21 years ago, and I communicate. We have a great district court and superior court web pages where it has the interpreter services that we provide, and it has the interpreter now, the interpreter due to COVID-19, the interpreter virtual services that we provide. And it's on your district court and superior court Clark County web pages. Some of the actions and the other action I've taken to understand my consumer, my litigant, my person that speaks another language, that's deaf, that's hard of hearing, is that I talk to them with their court interpreter. The court interpreters have provided me so much information about the culture of these folks, where they live, how their homeland is, what they do, what, you know, how these people survived in their country and lived in their country, and how they're living now in our country. If I didn't have court interpreters to teach me all this, I would not understand really what differences was, what a different of something was. So my court interpreters and the people that I reach out to and that I work with every day that comes into our courthouse, I understand, I listen, and I try to give them the help and the service that they need and that they're asking for. And that's what I think we all need to do as human beings, as legal professionals.
Do a lot more listening and communicating.
Listen and communicate and ask, how can I help you? Thank you.
So, thank you. I think we've melded question 2 and question 3 a little bit. So I'm just going to jump to you, Camara, and it seems like you're ready anyway. So a little bit in regards to influencing these legal institutions and increasing and maintaining diversity. What do we need to do?
Well, I just want to kind of just amplify, as Graciela said to us, like I've never actually heard it said like that. And it means so much to me because this last year has just been an experience, and I'm going to talk about it in personal terms. We're all working from home, and we watched the most horrific, devastating thing that so many have already known have been happening and have seen before, and the world moved on. So we got up and had to go to work the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and I think I was about the same as many other Black people in our country. About 3 days in, I didn't even know how to get out of bed after George Floyd. I didn't know how to make the next day happen. And I mean, I woke up and called early hours my boss and just cry. How do I go forward? How do I do this job? What do I do to move forward? And so I say that knowing that I had a structure in my office. I had a support system for what it was, and I had a person to call. But I went to 3 more meetings that day, and not one person between the time that this happened, to the time that it became public, and between the time that I was there at that moment, not one person mentioned what was going on in our meetings. Not one person mentioned the grief that someone like me must be feeling. Someone I would hope would be the whole world would be feeling. And it was asked of me, like, what's wrong with you? Why are you acting so weird in a meeting? And I'm really embarrassed to even say this. And I just couldn't even understand how they couldn't know what I was going through and what I was seeing. But I had a person in that meeting. Well, after I said, this is what's happening, this is what I feel, I had a person and what I expected of a response from those around me, from my administration, from the world that we're in and we're working in. When I said, we have to do something, and it just kind of went flat, I had that other person there that didn't look like me, who had a stronger voice, who stood up and demanded that my voice be heard, that amplified my voice and demanded that we do something different. That's how ARCS was formed. That right there, those moments, that's how our Action and Reform Committee was formed in our office. And it is making changes already, and it will make a difference going forward. And so I just love the way that Graciela put this, because it just puts into words my experience and what happened to me. And it was as far down as I went. I had somebody there lifting me up and holding me up. And so I just want to amplify her voice and saying that this isn't you may not know like what to say, but you can choose to amplify the voice of the person who's saying it. And so I will leave it there.
Christie, I thank you for sharing, Camara. I really appreciate that. Christie, what steps should our legal community take to increase and then maintain diversity?
I think there's a couple avenues that we can look at going forward. Of course, I'm going to push our membership committee, because I think we need to start having concrete or organized, intentional movement in our community. And I don't want to see just a lovely discussion and then nothing changing moving forward. So I'm hoping that by offering an opportunity for folks to actually work together on recruiting, retaining, supporting attorneys in our community, that we're all going to benefit going forward. But I think we actually need some intentionality behind that. And I'm hoping that folks will get on board and want to participate in that. Something that I would just like to mention that Pam had mentioned earlier, that I see as kind of a driving force, at least when we're looking at defendants in our criminal justice system here in Clark County, is the lack of data that we currently keep as a legal community. We want to pull statistics, to take a look at how we're really doing things. And I know that the ARC committee has started this process internally, but as a court system as a whole, and the reality is we don't have the data or the ability to pull that information. We can't now say how many folks have been charged with this crime versus this crime, and what is their racial makeup? Is it a criminal impersonation, or is it a misdemeanor false statement? Gosh, I would love to be able to pull the stats on that, because I have an inkling of what it is, but we don't have the ability here locally to pull that information. We don't have the ability to pull how many people of color are being held on this misdemeanor charge versus being released on their own recognizance for the same misdemeanor charge. We don't have the ability to say how many people were held in custody on this felony versus someone else. And part of that is we just don't track that data. And I've attended several meetings and it's like, well, who's in charge of tracking that data? And well, no one wants to track that data. So that for me is it's a small thing, but I think it's a crucial piece for us moving forward as a community. We need to start tracking that simple data. When I look at our criminal defendants coming in the morning, we need to capture that information so we can pull it later. I know how hard it was for Pam to try and come up with information just from our drug courts to present here tonight. And if we're going to be honest about what we're doing as a community, at the very least, we should be able to pull the numbers.
Well, and I want to just take a moment to, again, try to elevate Christie's voice here. If we do not have a deep awareness of what the truths that are around us and what is transpiring, because we're not looking at data, we will never reach a level of understanding, much less of targeting where we want to go, right? So fundamentally, we have to, I'm a big proponent of metrics, and we have to have the underlying clean data in order to be able to measure, not only to become aware, but then the next level is to seek an understanding of what the data is telling us. And then thirdly, to target how we're going to make changes, right? So we need to have that data. I don't know how that happens. And again, I don't, especially in the criminal justice system, I don't have any professional experience, so I can't speak to that. But certainly in terms of the recruiting of folks of color, we can do much better than we are. We can measure what that looks like now, and we can require certain things like the Banfield rule and others. We can require our elected officials to make sure that DEI efforts are top of mind. We can do all kinds of things like that, but it has to start from a place of awareness and understanding and then targeting. So sorry.
No, I think that's great. And Pam, since Christie was talking about some of the things you had, and I did want to ask you, what steps do you think our legal community should take to increase and then maintain diversity within our legal community?
I think the good start is what everyone has underscored. How do you take your temperature if you don't have a thermometer? Where's our measuring tool? And I appreciate Christie saying that she's raised this. I myself, when I was in substance abuse court, also raised breakouts of demographics of our participants, their graduation rates. I know that information on a national scale, and certainly when it's tied to grants, they track that information. I know as a court system, we track that information. Somebody is responsible for assembling that. Somebody holds the information, and I do not accept, sorry, I'm a woman of color, I don't accept that you're not able to pull it. It's not a question of it's in a black hole. It is out there. Somebody needs to take a step and pull it. The stakeholders, so I really encourage, when we're looking at how do we increase diversity, how do we maintain diversity, look at the data and find out what has been going on, what is going on. And if people are reticent to answer your question, for me as a person of color, that speaks volumes. That speaks performative commitment to equity and justice. It does not speak to following through with action. And I might be, as Graciela said, I don't think I'm on the younger side, but I might have an impatience because by virtue of what I've seen and experienced, and having people in the legal community that are people of color and having their experiences and sharing that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just not a set it and forget it. It is a real commitment that needs to be maintained. And, I was one of those attorneys of color at Schwabe 20 years ago. So I know that there are challenges there, and I'm encouraged that in all areas that people are making commitments, and those commitments are continuing, because you cannot let up on that.
Come back, Pam.
Yeah,
Well,
what I'll say is, the data is there, right? I mean, the people are there, the identifying factors are there, the care to gather that data, the people in power and control of that information need to commit to going and getting that information and making it important to the work that they're doing. And I think when we're coming down to that retention conversation, a lot of retention is not only about recruiting and bringing people in, it's about having a commitment to the things that people care about within your community, and making an effort to make those changes that people want to see. All right, so we've got about 6 minutes left, and we got some questions. Oh, I gotta. Do I have a hand up? Yeah.
My hand was. I just wanted to.
Sorry, just Gonzalez. Go ahead.
Say how. No, it's great to be on this call. I started my career in private practice, and a partner once explained to me when we were talking about compensation that if it isn't measured, it doesn't matter. And so you can tell what matters by what you're measuring. And if we're not measuring the disproportionality and the impact and who's affected, it means we don't care about it. So we have to show that we care about it by measuring it. The researchers say that becoming aware of implicit bias alone, without a plan, without the concrete steps that we've heard about, is worse than being ignorant, because then you pat yourself on the back and think that you've fixed it when you're just as bad as you always were. So the researchers are saying it's not okay just to teach the IAT, the implicit association test. You actually have to have a plan about how you're going to fix it when you identify the problem, and you have to put a budget behind it, because that's another way of measuring what matters. If it's not budgeted, it doesn't matter either. So those are two really important points. And then I'll say that it's not academic for everybody. Some people are learning about this by reading. Other people are learning about it because they've lived it and they've felt it. And that's very different. So you're going to encounter people who get upset about it when you're talking about it. And we have to understand that all emotion, if it's sincere, is involuntary. So let's let people get mad about things and emote a bit about it, and then get back to the task of saying, are we budgeting for it? And are we measuring it? And are we going to fix it? That's what matters.
All right, we have lots of questions. Deb, do you want to raise some of the ones you've seen?
Sure. I have been keeping track of the questions and trying to share them with the group, since I think they just get shown to the panelists. And it is my understanding that some of these questions may be able to be answered at a later time. Some of them are fairly big and might need some consideration and time for some of the panelists. So with the time we have, I want to throw out maybe a shorter question. And it's to any of the panelists that would like to answer it. On behalf of all the attendees, I would like to thank everyone for sharing these experiences, these comments, these ideas forward. And one of the things that I personally wonder, you've all experienced your own struggles in the legal system. You've had clients that have had struggles in the legal system. You've made observations about the legal system and its limitations and detriments. What do you do to, when you're kind of in that place where the heaviness and the hardness of it is really affecting you and impacting you? What do you do to find motivation, to find inspiration, and to continue the work that you do?
Justice Gonzalez, please.
I have two quick answers. Humor and poetry are the two things, that and exercise. So I love reading poetry, it helps a great deal. And then humor, I'll give you an example. So the question that I get asked a lot is, why are people of color so angry? And I think that is an example of misunderstanding, because the right question isn't why I'm angry. The right question is, why do you keep pissing me off? That's the right question. So that's an example of humor. And what it is intended to exemplify is that sometimes it's all about perspective. You're looking at the same problem, but from a different point of view.
Do you have a poet recommendation, Justice Gonzalez?
I like Neruda quite a bit. That's one. I like haiku because they're short.
There's the humor
And
again.
let me add this, Jeff. If you have not heard Amanda Gorman's poem from today,
Excellent.
you cannot end the day without having heard it.
Amanda Gorman spoke at the inaugural and gave one of the most beautiful performative poetry experiences I've ever seen. So I agree with you. Anybody else want to answer the question Deb just posed?
Deb, there was a question about court documents in other languages. The Washington State Courts page does have a few documents. It's mainly in Spanish. It's family law, access to courts, but it's in the Washington courts.gov/forms. There's a brief one for Vietnamese. It's the domestic violence protection orders, sexual assault. And I know it's still under work in progress. I think the Washington State Courts AOC is working diligently to translate a lot of the court documents that are in our Washington State courts. The only documents we have in our Clark County courts in our office is for probation, which is work crew. We have work crew for in the languages of Spanish, Russian, Vietnamese, and Chuukese. So those 4 documents are translated in their language so that the persons don't have to hire, don't have to call the phone and talk to an interpreter on the phone or hire an interpreter. So we've got that documents for probation. We have our deferred prosecution in Spanish. And that's all I can think of right now. Our infractions are in Spanish as well, Spanish and Russian and Vietnamese. So those are the 3 languages.
Thank you, Cindy.
Yep.
So we are basically out of time. It is the 7 o'clock hour. And so I just wanted to give anybody who is on the panel, if they want to say one last thing before we close out, an opportunity to do that, and then we'll finish up. Nobody wants to be the person to hold people up, right?
Well, I just wanted to remind you, Jeff, that I have a book that can be shared with anyone who is interested. So I'll leave it up to the bar to figure out how they decide who is the winner of the book. But
thank you, Pam. I forgot. So Pam has a copy of The Color of Law. Richard Rothstein, right? Wrote a great book about kind of the redlining issue we were talking about, but also intentional racism and the federal housing sphere. He gives a great drill down on all those issues. So great book. I don't know how we're going to pass it out, but Christie, we can figure that out at some point in the future.
I'd just like to add really quickly, Jeff, before
yeah, go ahead.
Since you asked for last thoughts. I just want to say that this was meant to be the beginning of a conversation, and that's it. And so it's really important that this not be the end of that conversation. I also want to say that this invitation was to the entire community and the entire legal community. It wasn't just about attorneys. And the way that we change the system is to make sure that that's all parts of our legal community, that we're talking about who our assistants are and who the people are that work in our courthouse and who our court runners are. Like we need to diversify. So the second that you walk through that door, whether it be to a firm or the prosecutor's office or it be to the courthouse, you see your face, that person in the cubicle next to you looks like you, or there's someone 2 cubicles down that looks like you who has had a similar experience. So this conversation starts now. The oath you should be giving when we walk out of here is that it is now personal to you. And this conversation you will continue to have no matter how uncomfortable it is moving forward.
Agreed. And so we will be hopefully convening further conversations on this in the near future. I really appreciate everybody who's participated in the conversation, in the questions we've received. We'll try and answer those questions separately if we haven't gotten to them now. But thank you to everybody, including Chief Justice Gonzalez, for coming out and participating today. So thank you very much, everybody.